Welcome to this new episode of Logos, Political Issues, and this series of podcasts that is the historical constitution, the ancient constitution, Jovellanos and Edmund Burke talking together about a shared concept. What is the historical constitution? What are all those elements that are part of our identity, political identity, that are so important in order to establish a social contract, but a social contract that is not only for the living, but also from the people who came before us, for the people that are going to arrive after us. In this way, I would like to start with a dramatic moment that was 1789 Paris. That year was the French Revolution, and after that, nothing was going to be the same for political theory. And also, nothing was going to be the same for France, that until our days is still recovering from a trauma that was the 1789 French Revolution. But not only France, also England, Spain, and many other nations around the world. That's why Edmund Burke and Jovellanos were talking about the French Revolution and were concerned. In the case of Edmund Burke, he was utterly concerned with the consequences of the French Revolution because the next nation was going to be England. And the same is true for Spain. Spain was very close by, and also Spain had a really direct influence from all the French intellectuals and the French Enlightenment. In that way, both thinkers were answering in the same manner. They were saying, yes, maybe what we need, maybe a possible solution, a positive idea is the historical constitution, the ancient constitution. Why? Because they were also understanding that they were inheriting something from the past that was going to be shared with the present community and the living community. And they were they were witnessing what was happening in France and what was happening in those years of terror, or those years also of the Napoleonic era. In the case of Jovellanos, Edmund Burke was not alive when Napoleon came, but Jovellanos experienced personally the Napoleonic troops entering Madrid, the Napoleonic troops entering Seville, the Napoleonic troops that were the ones that were persecuting Jovellanos in his last days in Asturias. He had to flee from his native city, Gijón, twice. And in the second time that he was sick was when he died. He died in Puerto de la Vega, Puerto de Vega, in Asturias. That is part of the 1789 French Revolution. The everlasting effects of a division between the past and the present. The French Revolution could be defined also as the separation or disintegration or schizophrenia between the past and the present, right? So the past is not anymore something to be taken into account. Only the present should be taken into account. Only what is happening today, it's important. We don't care about what happened. We don't care about our past generations. We don't care about the previous traditions, right? What was the answer of Edmund Burke and Jovellanos? They had a shared answer, and that's why it's all this series of the historical constitution. This series is so compelling and so interesting for our days because we see in them an answer to a change of times. Times are changing. The epochs are, one is dissolving the previous order is dissolving and a new order is emerging. What should we do in this case of crisis, right? That's why I believe both thinkers are stepping in one similar direction, that is of gratefulness of the past, gratefulness of what we have inherited, but also an ideal of reform. So let's go first with Edmund Burke and then with Jovellanos, and finally see the different characteristics that both share and some of them that are different, right? So Edmund Burke is concerned mainly with the idea that the ancient constitution, and this is a concept that is a characteristic that is shared with Jovellanos, is an inherited political ideal, something that is not yours. It's not that you created, but it's something that you are you are the one receiving. In that way, it's very easy to understand, for example, our national symbols as something inherited, or maybe our, if we think about, in many cases, right, we think about our boundaries as something that are inherited. We didn't decide that the boundary of our nation is going to be this one or this other one. The second characteristic of the ancient constitution that both also share is the respect for property, private property. Why? Because both thinkers, in the case of Edmund Burke and Jovellanos, in the case of Edmund Burke, he's surprised with the lack of respect for private property that is happening in the French Revolution, and specifically, he's really concerned with the expoliation of the properties of the church. And Edmund Burke makes a whole account of all the money and properties and lands that are being stolen from the church. And in the end, he says something that may be a similar image to our totalitarian states, or the potential totalitarian states that we could face, for example, in the 20th century, the Soviet Union or the Nazi Germany. That is, Edmund Burke says, they were not respecting private property because they wanted to control everything. They want they wanted the state to control everything. In that way, it's very current, this criticism made by Edmund Burke. They wanted to control everything. It's current because we can say, well, that was what the Nazi Germany was doing, or what the Soviet Union was doing, but also we can say that's what many states nowadays would like to do, right? To some extent, you say, well, that's the increase, right? The increase of the state. And the next question would be, and who is not having that property in that moment, right? Well, the persons, right? The individuals or the families. In the case of Jovellanos is very direct in his report on the agrarian reform of 1795, when he says, whenever we're going to acknowledge private property, the laborers of the land are going to be the protagonists, the ones that are going to be the owners of their own work. And in that way, they're going to work more happily and they're going to produce more. And that is going to positively impact the prosperity of the nation. So there's a win-win situation. The privates are going to be prosperous, and then the state also is going to be prosperous. So Jovellanos, in his report on the agrarian law, 1795, that is his most important economic work, he's enshrining private property not only as a natural right, that for him a natural right was something that was previous to the legal right, but as a right that was going to be the key for economic development in Spain. So both thinkers are in the same direction regarding private property as something that is part of this ancient constitution, is part of the idea of preserving, right, conserving what has been inherited. And who is going to conserve it? The families, the different the different groups within society. Another idea that both thinkers maybe differ, uh, but at the same time agree, is they are trying to avoid abstract ideals. That's why both thinkers are not accepting metaphysics. And I'm going to explain that this idea a little bit, because maybe we could say, well, if they are not accepting metaphysics, they are not accepting to some extent God within society or God within this ancient constitution. That's not true necessarily. What they are referring to when they say that they don't like metaphysics or they are not in favor of scholastics, in the case of Jovellanos, he's clear with that. He's not in favor of the scholastic university system. Well, but both thinkers, in the case of Edmund Burke, he was an Irish Protestant. In the case of Jovellanos, he was a practicing Catholic. They both had a religious mind. They both had a Christian God in mind whenever they talked about God, about providence. So the Asian constitution, to some extent, accepts the idea of the Christian God. But, and this is where I would like to go deeper, is the rejection of metaphysics. It's a rejection of abstract ideals that are not put it into practice. That's why Jovellanos says, well, I don't see the usefulness of the scholastic formation, of the scholastic universitary system. To some extent, we may need to understand that Jovellanos was looking for an improvement of economic and technological conditions in Spain that was necessary. And he meant with these ideas not that people didn't need any moral education, any religious education, but that people, citizens of Spain and the Hispanic nation, needed a practical knowledge of physics, metaphysics, agronomy. Well, not metaphysics, but agronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics. In this way, also Burke is in the same direction. He's saying we don't need abstract ideals. Because those abstract ideals are not rooted in a society, are not grateful with the past, are not looking for the people that are in the present and the ones who are going to come. But these ideals create a society that could be shaped in many forms without taking into account the constraints of reality. So metaphysics becomes something that denies reality from a practical standpoint. And let's remember, they are not saying that they are against any sort of theological outlook of life, but that they would like to highlight the importance of the practicality of ideas and the rootedness of the political community. In fact, to some extent, what they saw as metaphysical was the French Revolution, because the French Revolution, they said, to more Edmund Burke than Jovellanos, mainly Edmund Burke, this is not answering to the reality of France, because France is not only Paris. To some extent, Edmund Burke says, well, all the positive service that the clergy and also the noblemen are giving to the peasants in France. And this revolution is not taking that into account. And Jovellanos, in a very similar tone, talking about the role of the clergy with the peasants and with the laborers in Spain, highlights the importance of the clergy in rural Spain. But also says, apart from the moral and doctrinal formation, the clergy should instill in their in their in their students the practical knowledge of agronomy, mathematics, physics. They both agree. They both agree. To a lesser extent, Jovellanos in this more theoretical and systematic critique of metaphysics, but they both agree with this understanding that we need, or society needs, practical ideas and not only theoretical ideas. So they are against abstract ideas in favor of rooted. That's the idea of the historical constitution, a rooted political regime. In this way, we have compared three main aspects of the historical constitution: an inherited tradition, where private property and the civic duties are fundamental, and where metaphysics and the abstract ideas and the abstract ideals should be converted into practical and specific concepts. What has been the evolution of these ideas in the British and in the Spanish case? How this idea of historical constitution, of ancient constitution in the British case, have evolved a long time? Did they have any echoes afterwards? Any other political theories? Any other? What happened with this? Was this useful, or was only an idea that was there and stayed there? I would like to thank the Department of Politics and International Studies of the University of Cambridge, and also the Institute for Human Studies, for the support given to me in order to make this possible. I'm now in Cambridge, in the outskirts of Cambridge, in this Gothic church, and this has been possible thanks to their support. Thank you very much, and see you in the next episode.